The iron wheels of the stagecoach rattled over the rocky trail for the last time before coming to an abrupt halt, leaving Catherine Vaughn alone in the growing darkness of the Arizona Territory. 1878, with nothing but the haunting echo of her uncle's final words. Mineral Park ain't no place for a woman with big city ideas. The pain shooting through her left leg where she'd fallen from the coach seemed to confirm his cruel assessment as she watched the dust cloud disappear over the horizon, taking with it her last connection to civilization. Catherine tried to stand, gasping as white-hot agony tore through her leg. It was definitely broken, the bone at an unnatural angle beneath her torn skirt. The coach driver had simply tossed her carpetbag onto the ground beside her after the argument with her uncle had escalated, culminating in her being forcibly removed from their transport. Neither man had bothered to check if she was injured when she fell. Now, miles from Mineral Park with the sun setting rapidly behind the craggy mountains, Catherine faced the terrifying reality that she might not survive the night. She dragged herself to a large boulder, using it for support as she tried to assess her situation. Her honey-blonde hair had fallen from its pins, cascading around her shoulders as she fought back tears of pain and desperation. At 23, she had risked everything to come west after her parents' death, accepting her uncle's reluctant offer to join his household. His rejection had been swift and brutal once he realized she wouldn't be the docile niece he'd expected. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky when Catherine heard the soft, rhythmic beat of hooves approaching from the direction of Mineral Park. Her heart leaped with fear and hope simultaneously. Out here, a stranger could mean salvation or danger. She reached into her carpetbag, fingers closing around the small derringer her father had insisted she carry. The silhouette that emerged from the twilight shadows was tall and broad-shouldered, a man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. As he drew closer, Catherine could make out the details of his appearance. Worn leather chaps, a dusty Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a weathered face that had clearly seen its share of hardship. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and cautious as he slowed his horse. "You look to be in a fair bit of trouble." "I've been better," Catherine replied, keeping her voice steady despite the pain. "My uncle decided I wasn't worth the trouble of bringing to town." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Henry Garrett. Most folks call me Hank." He removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Mind if I take a closer look at that leg? I've some experience with breaks and sprains." Catherine hesitated, eyeing him warily. His face was tanned from years under the western sun, but his eyes were a clear, steady blue that somehow put her at ease despite her predicament. "Catherine Vaughn," she offered finally. "And I would be grateful for any help, Mr. Garrett." Hank knelt beside her, his movements gentle as he examined her leg without touching it. "This is a clean break from what I can see, but it needs to be set proper." He glanced up at the darkening sky. "We can't stay out here with night coming on. There's a lined shack about half a mile up the trail where we can get you settled." "I couldn't possibly," Catherine began, propriety warring with necessity. "Madam, with all due respect, you don't have many options," Hank interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "There's wolves and worse in these hills after dark, and that leg needs tending. I give you my word as a gentleman that your virtue is safe with me." Catherine knew he was right. With a resigned nod, she allowed him to carefully lift her onto his horse. The pain nearly caused her to faint, but she clenched her teeth and held on as Hank led the stallion toward shelter, walking alongside and keeping a steadying hand on her good leg. The line shack was little more than a crude one-room cabin with a small corral attached, but to Catherine, it looked like salvation. Hank helped her inside, settling her on a narrow cot while he lit a lantern and stoked the remains of a fire in the small stone hearth. "Been using this place off and on while I work the range for the Diamondback outfit," he explained, moving with the efficient ease of a man accustomed to making do. "It ain't much, but it'll keep us warm and dry." Catherine watched as he heated water, then carefully cut away the fabric of her skirt around the injury. His hands were large and calloused, yet surprisingly gentle as he examined the break more thoroughly. "This will hurt something fierce, Miss Vaughn," he warned, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "But it needs doing if you're ever to walk proper again." "I understand," Catherine said, gripping the edge of the cot. "Please proceed, Mr. Garrett." Hank gave her a strip of leather to bite down on. Then, with careful precision, he manipulated the broken bone back into alignment. Catherine's scream was muffled by the leather, tears streaming down her face as white-hot agony exploded through her leg. Just when she thought she would surely faint, the bone slipped into place with a sickening sound, and the excruciating pain eased to a throbbing ache. "You did well," Hank said softly, his own forehead beaded with sweat from the concentration required. "Braver than most men I've known." He worked quickly then, splinting her leg with strips of wood from a broken crate and binding it tightly with clean bandages from his saddlebag. By the time he finished, Catherine was exhausted, her face pale and drawn. "Why would you help a stranger like this?" she asked as he covered her with a worn but clean blanket. Hank shrugged, turning to prepare a simple meal of beans and coffee. "My pa always said you measure a man by what he does when nobody's watching. Out here, turning your back on someone in need is as good as killing them yourself." He paused, a shadow crossing his features. "I've seen enough death to last several lifetimes." Catherine sensed there was more to his story, perhaps something to do with the war between the states that had ended 13 years prior, but she didn't press. Instead, she accepted the tin cup of coffee he offered, letting its warmth spread through her trembling hands. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me for a spell," Hank said, settling on a three-legged stool near the fire. "That leg'll need at least 6 weeks to mend properly, and you shouldn't be moved far for the first couple weeks." 6 weeks, Catherine's voice rose in dismay. "But I've nowhere to go. My uncle has made it clear I'm not welcome." "Well, I reckon this shack is as good a place as any to heal up," Hank replied pragmatically. "I can ride into Mineral Park tomorrow, let folks know what happened. Maybe there's someone there who'd take you in once you're mobile. And until then?" Catherine asked, suddenly very aware of her compromised position. Hank's expression remained respectful but determined. "Until then, Miss Vaughn, I'll be sleeping in the lean-to with my horse and you'll be safe inside. I give you my word on that." Despite her pain and exhaustion, Catherine found herself believing him. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she wondered what twist of fate had sent this honorable cowboy down her path at the exact moment she needed him most. The next morning, Catherine awoke to find Hank already up, cooking breakfast over the rekindled fire. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the small cabin, making her stomach growl despite her discomfort. "Morning," he greeted, his voice gentle. "How's the pain?" "Present," Catherine admitted, "but bearable. Thank you for asking." Hank nodded, bringing her a plate and helping her sit up enough to eat. "I need to ride into town for supplies and to send word to the ranch where I work. Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" Catherine nodded, though the thought of being left alone in this wilderness made her heart race. "I'll manage, Mr. Garrett. What will you tell people in town?" His expression softened slightly. "Just the truth that you're injured and need time to heal." Nothing that would compromise your reputation. After Hank left, Catherine took stock of her situation more thoroughly. The cabin was sparse but clean, with a small shelf of books that surprised her. Most were well-worn classics, including volumes of Shakespeare and Dickens that seemed at odds with her rescuer's rugged exterior. She wondered what other surprises lay beneath his stoic demeanor. When Hank returned late that afternoon, he carried not only supplies but also news. "Spoke with the telegraph operator," he said, unloading parcels onto the rough wooden table. "Your uncle's already left town, heading back east. Said something about you deciding to stay in Mineral Park with friends." Catherine laughed bitterly. "How convenient for him. I have no friends here." "You have one," Hank said simply, before continuing with his tasks. The words hung in the air between them, a small comfort in Catherine's uncertain future. She watched as he efficiently organized the supplies: food, bandages, a bottle of laudanum for pain, and unexpectedly, a stack of newspapers and 2 books. "Thought you might like something to read," he explained gruffly when he caught her looking. "Town's got a decent little lending library." That evening, as Hank checked her splint and made sure she was comfortable for the night, Catherine gathered her courage. "Why are you doing all this? You could have just taken me to town and been done with it." Hank was silent for a long moment, adjusting the lantern's flame lower. "5 years ago, I was thrown from a horse in a ravine about 10 miles west of here. Broke my leg in 2 places, crawled 3 miles before passing out from the pain." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held old shadows. "A Hualapai medicine man found me, set my leg, kept me alive until I could ride again. Never asked for anything in return. Sometimes, Miss Vaughn, a debt can only be paid forward." With that, he bade her good night and stepped outside to his makeshift bed in the lean-to, leaving Catherine with much to think about as she drifted to sleep. Days passed slowly, establishing a routine that brought unexpected comfort to Catherine's life. Each morning, Hank would prepare breakfast before riding out to work for a few hours on the nearby Diamondback Ranch, returning by midday to check on her. He'd explain to his employer, a gruff but fair-minded rancher named Williams, about Catherine's situation, and the man had generously allowed Hank to adjust his work schedule to accommodate her care. As her pain lessened, Catherine found ways to contribute despite her immobility. She took over the cooking when Hank brought her a crate to sit on near the stove, and her skilled hands turned simple ingredients into meals that made the cowboy's eyes widen in appreciation. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked one evening over a stew that somehow made tough venison taste like fine dining. Catherine smiled, pleased by his reaction. "My mother insisted I learn, even though we had a cook in Philadelphia. She said a woman should never be completely dependent on servants or husband." "Wise woman," Hank commented. "My ma was the same way. Made sure all of us could cook and tend basic injuries before we were 12. "You have siblings?" Catherine asked, realizing how little she knew about the man who had so dramatically altered her life's path. Hank nodded, a rare smile softening his features. "2 brothers and a sister, all back in Texas. Haven't seen them since before the war." When Catherine inquired further, he spoke briefly of fighting for the Confederacy, of returning to find their family farm destroyed, and of heading west to start anew while his siblings rebuilt in Texas. She sensed there was more, perhaps guilt or regret, behind his sparse words, but she didn't press. As the second week of her convalescence began, a spring storm descended on the mountains, bringing relentless rain that turned the trails to mud and kept Hank at the cabin for 3 days straight. Forced proximity broke down some of the careful formality between them, and Catherine found herself sharing stories of her life in Philadelphia, her parents' loving but strict household, her father's shipping business, and the devastation of losing both parents to influenza the previous year. "I had nowhere else to go," she explained as they sat by the fire, rain drumming on the cabin roof. "Uncle Thomas was my only living relative, and he'd written after the funeral offering me a place in his home. I sold everything, thinking I was coming to a new family, only to be abandoned on a deserted trail," Hank finished, his voice hardening. "Some men don't deserve the title of family." "What will become of me when I can walk again?" Catherine asked, voicing the question that haunted her quiet moments. "I have a little money, but not enough to return east and no prospects here." Hank studied the flames for a long moment. Mineral parks growing. They need a school teacher, the last one left to get married. The mine manager's wife mentioned it when I was in town. Catherine felt a flicker of hope. She had completed finishing school and had always loved learning. "Do you think they would consider me? An educated Eastern lady. They'd be fools not to," Hank replied with such conviction that Catherine couldn't help but believe him. The storm cleared on the fourth day, and Hank rode out to the ranch, returning with not only his wages but also a letter from Mrs. Patterson, the mine manager's wife, expressing interest in meeting Catherine once she was mobile enough to come to town. It was the first piece of good news Catherine had received since arriving in Arizona Territory, and she found herself laughing with genuine delight as she read the kindly worded letter. "Thank you," she said, impulsively reaching for Hank's hand as he stood beside her chair. "For everything." His fingers closed briefly around hers, warm and reassuring, before he gently withdrew. "Just doing what's right, Miss Vaughn." But Catherine was beginning to suspect there was far more to Henry Garrett than just doing what's right. She had noticed how his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he had started bringing wildflowers to brighten up the place, and how he listened intently to every story she told, as if her words were precious things to be collected and treasured. For her part, Catherine found herself watching the door each day, counting the hours until Hank's return. She noticed details about him that she carefully stored away, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the methodical way he cleaned his revolver each evening, and how tenderly he checked her splint, his strong hands infinitely gentle against her skin. By the beginning of the third week, Catherine could hobble short distances with the aid of a crutch Hank had fashioned from a forked branch. Her first steps were cause for celebration, though Hank cautioned her not to overexert herself. "The bone's knitting, but it's still fragile," he warned as he watched her practice walking the length of the cabin. "Don't want you undoing all our good work." Catherine smiled at his use of "our," recognizing how thoroughly intertwined their lives had become in such a short time. Each day brought new revelations about this quiet, steadfast man who had literally carried her from the brink of disaster. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine gathered her courage. "Tell me something true about yourself, Henry Garrett, something you don't tell most people." Hank was silent for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "I killed 17 men during the war that I know of," he said, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Not in battle, but as a scout and sharpshooter. Used to think it made me some kind of hero." He exhaled slowly. "Now I just wonder about the families they left behind." Catherine felt the weight of his confession, understanding that he had shared a piece of his soul rarely exposed to light. "And that's why you saved me, isn't it? Not just because it was right, but because you're trying to balance some cosmic ledger." Hank turned to look at her then, surprise evident in his features. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "But now." He shook his head as if the words he needed were too difficult to find. "Now, Catherine prompted gently. Now I'm just grateful for every day I get to know you, he said simply, the truth of it plain in his steady gaze. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Catherine knew that any proper lady would look away, change the subject, maintain the careful distance propriety demanded. Instead, she reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand atop his. "As am I," she whispered. That night, as Catherine lay in her cot listening to the familiar sounds of Hank settling in the lean-to, she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with her rescuer. It was foolish, perhaps even reckless, given her uncertain future, but the knowledge settled in her heart with the weight of inevitability. The fourth week brought significant improvement to Catherine's mobility. She could now move around the cabin with minimal pain, though longer walks still required the crutch. Hank brought news from town that the school board was eager to meet her, having received glowing recommendations from Mrs. Patterson based on Hank's descriptions of Catherine's education and character. "They're willing to hold the position for you," he explained over dinner. "Term doesn't start for another month anyway." Catherine felt both excitement and apprehension at the prospect. "Where would I live?" "I can't exactly stay in a line shack permanently. Mrs. Patterson has offered you a room until you get settled," Hank replied, though something in his tone suggested he had reservations about the arrangement. "It's a proper solution." "Proper," Catherine echoed, hearing all that remained unsaid. "And what about you, Hank? Will you go back to regular work at the Diamondback once I'm in town?" He nodded, focusing intently on his plate. That was always the plan. The thought of their paths diverging created a hollow feeling in Catherine's chest. She had grown accustomed to his presence, his quiet strength, the comfortable silences they shared. The prospect of life without him seemed impossibly bleak. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could still see each other. I'm sure you come to town occasionally." Hank looked up then, his blue eyes searching her face. "Would you want that, Catherine?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver of awareness through her. "Very much," she answered honestly. Something shifted between them that night, a mutual acknowledgement that what they shared had grown beyond the boundaries of their initial circumstances. As the days passed, their conversations deepened, touching on hopes and dreams long held private. Hank spoke of his desire to someday have his own ranch, a modest spread where he could raise quality horses. Catherine shared her love of teaching and her secret passion for writing stories, something her parents had discouraged as impractical. "I've been working on something while you're out," she admitted shyly, gesturing to the pages tucked beneath her pillow. "A story about the West, though I'm sure it's dreadfully inaccurate." "I'd like to read it sometime," Hank said, his genuine interest warming her heart. Their casual touches became more frequent, his hand lingering on her shoulder, her fingers brushing his when passing a cup or plate. Each contact sent sparks of awareness through Catherine, awakening feelings she had never experienced in Philadelphia's proper drawing rooms. At the beginning of the fifth week, Hank helped Catherine outside for a longer walk, supporting her as they made their way to a small stream that ran behind the cabin. The spring air was fresh with the scent of wildflowers, and birds called from the cottonwoods that lined the water. "It's beautiful here," Catherine said, breathing deeply of the clean mountain air. "So different from what I expected of the West." "What did you expect?" Hank asked, his arm steady around her waist as they navigated the uneven ground. Catherine laughed softly. "Endless desert, I suppose." "Dusty towns filled with gunslingers, not this." She gestured to the verdant landscape before them. "We have those too," Hank assured her with a smile, "but I've always preferred the mountains." They reached a flat boulder beside the stream, and Hank helped Catherine sit, ensuring her splinted leg was properly supported. He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they watched the water flowing over smooth stones in comfortable silence. "I don't want to go to town," Catherine said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "Or rather, I don't want to leave this." She gestured between them, unable to find more precise words for what they shared. Hank turned to look at her, his expression solemn. "What are you saying, Catherine?" Heart pounding, she met his gaze directly. "I'm saying that these weeks with you have been the most honest of my life, that I care for you in ways I never expected to care for anyone. That the thought of returning to propriety and pretense feels like a prison sentence." Hank's eyes darkened as he reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers impossibly tender against her skin. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, though his touch belied his words. "No home, no fortune, just a cowboy's wages and hard work." "You offered me life when I might have died," Catherine countered. "You've shown me kindness, respect, and understanding when I was at my most vulnerable. What more could I possibly need?" The tension between them grew until it seemed the very air crackled with it. When Hank finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've wanted to kiss you since that second night, when you thanked me for the laudanum even though you were hurting so bad you could barely speak. Your courage humbled me." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "What's stopping you now?" For answer, Hank leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. Catherine responded with all the feelings that had been building within her, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Hank rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "This complicates things," he murmured. Catherine couldn't help but laugh softly. "I think things became complicated the moment you found me on that trail, Henry Garrett." He smiled then, a full, unguarded expression that transformed his features and made him look years younger. "No regrets, though." "Not a single one," she assured him, leaning in to claim another kiss. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, a domestic scene that now felt precious rather than merely practical, they spoke of possibilities. Hank was clear-eyed about the challenges they would face. The gossip their unconventional meeting would generate, the difficulty of starting a life together with limited resources, the adjustments Catherine would need to make to Western living. "I won't pretend it'll be easy," he said as they sat before the fire, her hand clasped in his. "But I know what I feel for you is real, Catherine. It's grown stronger every day, watching your strength, your determination, your kindness." Catherine squeezed his hand. "In Philadelphia, I was surrounded by suitors who saw only my father's money and connections. Here, I had nothing, not even the ability to stand, and you saw value in me anyway." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with certainty. "That's the foundation I want to build upon." Their courtship progressed in the protected bubble of the Line Shack, away from society's prying eyes and judgments. Each day brought new discoveries, Hank's surprising talent for whistling complex melodies, Catherine's competitive streak when they played checkers with a set he carved from wood scraps, the perfect alignment of their bodies when they sat side by side watching the sunset. By the 6th week, Catherine's leg had healed enough that the splint could be removed, though she still walked with a slight limp that Hank assured her would fade with time and exercise. The prospect of their separation loomed larger as her mobility increased, prompting them to make decisions about their future. "I want to court you properly," Hank insisted as they discussed their return to town. "Take you to dinner at the hotel, introduce you to people as a gentleman would a lady he admires." Catherine appreciated his concern for her reputation, even as she found it somewhat amusing given their weeks of isolated cohabitation. "And I want to accept the teaching position," she replied, "to establish myself as more than just the Eastern lady who arrived under unusual circumstances." They agreed that Catherine would stay with Mrs. Patterson as planned while Hank returned to his full duties at the Diamondback. He would call on her in town, following the conventions of proper courtship, while they both worked toward their shared future. The day before they were to leave for Mineral Park, Catherine stood by the stream where they had shared their first kiss, watching the play of sunlight on water. She heard Hank's approach, recognizing the rhythm of his footsteps without turning. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Catherine shook her head, turning to face the man who had irrevocably changed the course of her life. "Just saying goodbye to this place. It will always be special to me." Hank took her hands in his expression unusually solemn. "There's something I need to ask you before we rejoin civilization." He hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "I know it's fast by most standards. We've known each other only 6 weeks. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Catherine's heart began to race as Hank lowered himself to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "Catherine Vaughn, I love you. I think I've loved you since I found you on that trail, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as joy bloomed in her chest. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Henry Garrett." Hank rose and drew her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple silver band set with a small turquoise stone. "It's not much," he said apologetically. "Bought it from a silversmith in town last week." "It's perfect," Catherine assured him as he slipped it onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." The next morning, they packed their few belongings and prepared to leave the lined shack that had been their sanctuary. Catherine took one last look around the humble space that had witnessed their extraordinary beginning. "Ready for the next chapter?" Hank asked, offering his arm for support as they stepped outside. Catherine smiled up at him, seeing their future reflected in his clear blue eyes. "More than ready." He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they rode toward Mineral Park and whatever adventures awaited them there. The path ahead might not be easy, but Catherine knew with absolute certainty that the journey would be worthwhile because they would face it together. Their arrival in Mineral Park caused quite a stir, despite Hank's efforts to enter town discreetly. It seemed news of the Eastern lady with the broken leg had spread during their absence, and curious onlookers gathered as they made their way to the Patterson home near the silver mine that was the town's economic heart. Mrs. Patterson, a plump, energetic woman in her 40s, welcomed Catherine warmly, ushering her into a comfortable bedroom while sending Hank to fetch the doctor to examine Catherine's healing leg. "We've been so worried about you, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, helping Catherine settle into a chair. "Mr. Garrett has kept us informed, of course, but it's a relief to see you looking so well after such an ordeal." Catherine smiled, touched by the woman's genuine concern. "Mr. Garrett took excellent care of me," she replied, deliberately keeping her tone neutral despite the joy that filled her at the mere mention of his name. Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes didn't miss the ring on Catherine's finger, however. "I see he did," she remarked with a knowing smile. "And I suspect there's quite a story there." Catherine blushed, but met the older woman's gaze directly. "There is, and I hope you'll allow me to tell it to you properly. Mr. Garrett and I have developed a deep attachment during my recovery, and he has asked me to be his wife." To Catherine's surprise, Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together in delight. "Oh, my dear, that's wonderful news. Henry Garrett is one of the finest men in the territory, honest, hardworking, and respected by all who know him." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "And between us, he's been far too solitary since arriving here 3 years ago. It's high time someone brought some happiness into his life." The doctor's visit confirmed that Catherine's leg had healed remarkably well, though he cautioned her to continue using a cane for another few weeks to avoid re-injury. When Hank returned that evening to call on Catherine formally, he found her sitting in the Pattersons' parlor, dressed in a borrowed blue dress that brought out the gold in her hair, looking every inch the proper Philadelphia lady despite her frontier surroundings. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her with a tip of his freshly brushed hat, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "I trust you're settling in comfortably." "Indeed, Mr. Garrett," she replied, struggling to maintain her composure when all she wanted was to cross the room and throw herself into his arms. Mrs. Patterson has been most welcoming. Their careful formality dissolved into laughter when Mrs. Patterson bustled in, waving away their pretense. "Oh, for heaven's sake! I've already told Miss Vaughn how delighted I am about your engagement. No need for this silly charade on my account." The following days established a new rhythm to their lives. Catherine met with the school board and was officially offered the position of teacher for the town's growing population of children. Hank returned to the Diamondback Ranch but rode into town every evening to spend time with his fiancée, their courtship now conducted in full view of the community. To Catherine's relief, the people of Mineral Park proved far more accepting than she had feared. There were whispers, of course curious speculation about the weeks they had spent alone in the line shack, but the community's respect for Hank and their need for an educated teacher outweighed any tendency toward scandal. Catherine threw herself into preparations for both her wedding and her teaching career, determined to build a meaningful life in this rugged frontier town. She found unexpected allies in Mrs. Patterson and several other miners' wives who helped her navigate the social dynamics of Mineral Park, while introducing her to the practical skills she would need as a rancher's wife. One afternoon, as Catherine was examining textbooks for her future students, a shadow fell across the doorway of the small building that served as the town's school. She looked up to find Hank watching her, his expression one of quiet pride. "You look right at home there," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "Those children are lucky to have you." Catherine smiled, closing the book in her hands. "I'm the lucky one. A month ago I thought I had lost everything. Now I have a purpose, a community, and you." She crossed to him, propriety forgotten as she reached up to touch his weathered cheek. "Especially you." Hank caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "I've been thinking about our future," he said, his voice low and serious. "I've saved most of my wages these past 3 years. It's not a fortune, but it might be enough for a small piece of land north of here. Good water access, decent grazing." Catherine's heart leapt at the implication. "Your own ranch," he nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "It would be a modest start. Hard work, basic living, nothing like what you were accustomed to in Philadelphia." "It sounds perfect," Catherine said firmly. "I don't need luxury, Hank. I need purpose and love and the chance to build something meaningful with you." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I put in an offer this morning. 50 acres to start, with an option for more as we can afford it." Catherine threw her arms around his neck, propriety be damned. "Our home," she whispered against his shoulder. "Our future." 2 weeks later, on a clear May morning, Catherine stood in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, dressed in a simple white gown with wildflowers in her hair. The limp in her walk was barely noticeable as Mr. Patterson escorted her to where Hank waited beside the town's minister, his blue eyes filled with emotion at the sight of her. Their wedding was attended by most of the town, a celebration that spilled from the Patterson home into the street as miners and ranchers, shopkeepers and their families gathered to witness the union of the Eastern lady and the cowboy who had saved her. I, Henry James Garrett, take you, Catherine Elizabeth Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded wife. Hank's deep voice carried clearly as he spoke his vows, his gaze never leaving hers. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Catherine's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment from abandoned and broken on a lonely trail to loved and whole, surrounded by a community that was rapidly becoming her own. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hank leaned down to kiss her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The cheers of the townspeople washed over them, a blessing on their union and the life they would build together. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting that showcased the frontier town's capacity for joy. As the sun began to set, Hank led Catherine to where his chestnut stallion waited, saddled and ready for the journey to their new home. "Ready, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, his voice warm with promise as he helped her mount. "I've been ready since the moment you found me," Catherine replied, her heart full to bursting as he swung up behind her. They rode away from town as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, heading north toward the land that would become their ranch. The simple cabin Hank had worked day and night to prepare over the past weeks came into view as they crested a small rise, a humble beginning for their shared dreams. Inside, Catherine found a dwelling that was basic but prepared with obvious care. Fresh curtains at the windows, a bed covered with a handmade quilt, a bookshelf already filled with her small collection of beloved volumes, and a desk where she could write her stories. "Welcome home," Hank said, standing somewhat uncertainly in the doorway as she explored. "I know it's not much yet." Catherine silenced him with a kiss that conveyed everything words could not: her gratitude, her joy, her absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. When they finally parted, she smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love and promise. "It's everything," she whispered, "because you're here." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their union as natural and right as if they had been made for one another. Afterward, lying in Hank's arms as moonlight filtered through the cabin window, Catherine marveled at the path that had brought her to this moment. "I was so frightened when my uncle abandoned me on that trail," she murmured, her head resting on Hank's chest. "I thought it was the worst moment of my life. Now I see it was actually the beginning of everything good." Hank's arms tightened around her. "When I found you, I was just trying to do right by a stranger in need. I never imagined I was finding my future, my heart." In the years that followed, the Garrett ranch grew and prospered, as did their family. Catherine continued teaching in Mineral Park until the birth of their first child, a son they named James Thomas, in the spring of 1880. A daughter, Elizabeth Rose, followed 18 months later, her arrival coinciding with the expansion of their ranch to 100 acres and the construction of a larger home to accommodate their growing family. Catherine discovered an unexpected talent for ranch management, keeping the books with the same precision she had once applied to her teaching, while Hank's expertise with horses attracted buyers from as far away as California. They worked side by side, partners in every sense, their love deepening with each challenge overcome and triumph shared. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting, Hank surprised Catherine with a special gift, a leather-bound volume containing the story she had begun writing during her convalescence, now completed and privately published by a printer in Prescott. "Your voice deserves to be heard," he told her as she ran her fingers over the embossed title, "Found on the Trail, a Western Romance." "Our story," Catherine whispered, opening the cover to find the dedication. "For H.G., who set more than my broken leg, he set my heart and soul on the right path." Their children grew strong and capable in the freedom of the Arizona Territory, James inheriting his father's way with horses and quiet strength, Elizabeth developing her mother's love of learning and storytelling. The family weathered the inevitable hardships of frontier life: drought years, harsh winters, the economic uncertainties of the 1880s with the resilience that had characterized their beginning. By 1890, the Garrett Ranch was one of the most respected in the territory, known for its quality horses and cattle, and for the hospitality offered to travelers. The original line shack, where Hank had nursed Catherine back to health, was preserved and maintained, a private monument to the love that had blossomed within its humble walls. On a crisp autumn afternoon in 1893, 15 years after their first meeting, Catherine stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching Hank teach their 10-year-old son to break a spirited young colt in the corral nearby. Elizabeth sat at her mother's feet, absorbed in a book of poetry, her dark hair so like her father's falling in waves around her shoulders. "Mama," Elizabeth asked, looking up suddenly, "is it true that you couldn't walk when you first met Papa?" Catherine smiled, easing herself into a rocking chair, her hand resting on the slight swell of her abdomen where their third child, a surprise blessing, was growing. "That's right. My leg was broken, and I was all alone until your father found me. And he stayed with you until you could walk again." The girl prompted, though she had heard the story many times before. "He did," Catherine confirmed, her gaze drifting to where Hank was now laughing at something James had said, the sun glinting off the silver now threading his dark hair. "He stayed, and then he helped me build a whole new life, step by step." Elizabeth nodded, satisfied with the familiar reassurance of the tale. "It's just like your book." "Similar," Catherine agreed with a small smile. "Though the book has a bit more adventure and a few less arguments about proper fence construction." Her daughter giggled and returned to her reading, while Catherine continued to watch her husband and son, her heart full with the quiet joy of their shared life. When Hank looked up and caught her eye across the yard, his smile was as warm and true as it had been on that first day when he had promised to see her safely through her healing. He had kept that promise and so many more in the years since, walking beside her through every triumph and trial, his love as steady and enduring as the mountains that cradled their home. And Catherine, who had once been abandoned and broken on a lonely trail, now knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just healing for her body, but a wholeness of spirit she had never imagined possible. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across their land, Hank made his way to the porch, climbing the steps to stand beside her chair. Without a word, he leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her growing belly. "Happy?" he asked simply, the question that had become a ritual between them over the years. "Completely," Catherine answered, linking her fingers with his. "You?" Hank's smile deepened, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had always loved. "Beyond measure," he said, and in those two words lay all the truth and promise their love had ever needed. As twilight gathered around them, The Garrett family moved inside their home, the home built on a foundation of unexpected rescue, patient healing, and a love that had transformed two solitary souls into something far greater than either could have become alone. And in the soft glow of lamplight, surrounded by the family they had created together, Catherine knew that the broken trail that had seemed like an ending had truly been just the beginning of their remarkable journey.